evening, everyone, and I'm really sorry I can't speak to you in Spanish, but I know Federico up somewhere there is going to be my Spanish voice, so thank you, Fede. I would, however, like to bring into this space, I'm sure for the very first time, a greeting in a language that I know quite well, and most of you probably do not. I would like to bring you the greeting of the wild chimpanzee. Hello. And during the course of this little talk, I want to pay tribute to certain people who've really helped me along my path in life. And the first of those people that I want to thank is my mother. Because when I was a little girl growing up in England, I always loved animals. Apparently, even before I could talk, I was watching animals. And I had a very understanding mother. So when she came into my bedroom one night and found that I'd taken a whole handful of wriggling earthworms to bed with me, she, instead of saying, "Ugh, throw those dirty things away," she just said very quietly, "Jane, they need the earth." And so together we took them back into the garden. And we went to stay on a farm in the country when I was 5 years old. This was really exciting for me because I could come face to face with cows and pigs and horses. And I was given a job to collect the hens' eggs. There were no cruel battery farms in those days. The hens pecked around in the farmyard. And so I was putting these eggs into my little basket. But apparently I began asking everybody, where does the egg come out of the hen? Because I couldn't see a hole big enough for the egg to come out. And nobody told me to my satisfaction. So I hid in a hen house and I waited for 5 hours and I saw a hen lay an egg. The problem was my family didn't know where I was and my mother was out searching and it was getting dark. And when she saw this excited little girl rushing towards the house, instead of getting angry, she saw my shining eyes and sat down to hear the wonderful story of how a hen lays an egg. So right from the beginning, she was understanding and supportive and helpful. She found books for me about animals because she thought, then Jane will learn to read quicker. I was approximately 10 years old, somewhere between 10 and 11 years old, when I found a second-hand book because we couldn't afford new books. It was called Tarzan of the Apes. I had just enough money to buy it. And I took it home, and we had a tree in the garden that I loved, and I took this book up the tree, and I read it from start to finish. And then I read it again, and there was this wonderful man living with the apes out in the jungle. And of course I fell in love with him. Little girls of 10 are very romantic. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane, didn't he? I was very, very jealous. But that was when my dream began. I would grow up, go to Africa, live with animals, and write books about them. Everybody laughed at me. World War II was raging then. We didn't have any money. Africa was thought of as the dark continent. We didn't know much about it. And I was the wrong sex. I was a girl. And back then girls didn't have those opportunities. So people said, Jane, why don't you think about something you can achieve? Forget this nonsense about Africa. But not my mother. She said, if you really want something, then you must work really hard. You must take advantage of opportunity, and you must never give up. So you see, she was right. When I left school at 18, I think most of my friends went on to college, to university, but we didn't have the money, and you couldn't get a scholarship back then unless you were good in a foreign language, and I never was any good at foreign languages. So it was again my mother. She said, well, do a secretarial course, then perhaps you can get a job in Africa. So I did that. I was working in London. I got a letter from a school friend whose parents had moved to Kenya, inviting me for a holiday. Yes, opportunity. Well, didn't get much money in those days, so I went home and I worked in a hotel as a waitress because I could live without paying rent. And eventually I saved up enough money for a return fare to Africa by boat. That was the cheapest back then. And so I was 23 years old when I arrived by boat in Kenya. Today, young people of both sexes go off at 23. Nobody thinks anything of it. Back then, it was really uncommon even for boys to go off to new countries at 23. So it was an adventure. I was staying with my friend. I heard about the late Louis Leakey, a paleontologist, a very famous one, who with his family found some prehistoric ape-like, human-like creatures that made his name famous. Zinjanthropus and George and Dearboy and all the Australopithecines and Homo habilis, and these were at fossil sites in Africa. So that when I was going around this museum yesterday and your wonderful fossil site here this morning, I was reminded very much of those early days working with Louis Leakey. He let me go with him, his wife, and one other young English girl to a site that is very famous now, Alderby Gorge, because that's where Homo habilis was found, and Zinjanthropus, or the Nutcracker Man. But when I went there, no human remains had been found, only the remains of the same kind of animals that wandered around here, I was learning this morning, except that in Africa the animals were much bigger because it was hotter, and here, because it was cold, the animals were smaller. But for me it was wonderful because Alderby was unknown when I went to it. And today, of course, it's a very famous site. I was there when all the animals were there, the living animals. And when Gillian and I were allowed to go out on the plains after the hard day's work looking for fossils, I met a rhino one evening. I met a young male lion. It was a bit frightening. He followed Gillian and me for about twice the length of this theatre, which was, as I say, a bit scary, but it was very exciting. And I think that was when Louis decided to offer me the opportunity of going to live with not just any animal, but the one most like us, the chimpanzee. Would I be prepared to go and try and learn about their behavior? And it's interesting, since here we are in this Museum of Human Evolution, to understand why Louis Leakey wanted chimpanzees to be studied. He also got Diane Fossey to study gorillas and Birute to study orangutans, but I was the first. And he reasoned like this: Jane, if you find behavior that's similar or perhaps the same in chimpanzees today and human beings today, if, as he believed, there was a common ancestor, an ape-like, human-like creature about 6 million years ago, those behaviors may have been present in that common ancestor. And therefore, we humans may have brought these shared behaviors up through our long evolutionary pathway. He hoped that what I learned about chimpanzees would help him have a better feeling for how early humans might have behaved. And indeed, we find out today how wise he was, because much of the behavior that I've observed in chimpanzees and others have observed in chimpanzees and the other great apes are used when people are thinking about the probable behavior of these ancestors that we see in the museum here. Well, there were problems for me getting to Gombe National Park, which was the site Lewis suggested. First of all, how was he going to get money for this young girl with no degree straight out from England? In fact, I had to go back to England and wait for a whole year until finally he found a wealthy businessman who said, all right, Lewis, here's money for 6 months. Second problem, back then, what we call Tanzania today was Tanganyika. It was part of the British colonial empire, and the British authorities were not prepared to take responsibility for this young girl. In the end, because Lewis never gave up, they said, oh, all right, but she must have a companion. So who volunteered to come? For the first 4 months, my same amazing mother. And she was there to encourage me, because in those early days, when the chimpanzees saw me, for them I was a peculiar white ape. They'd never seen anything like me before. They would take one look and run away. And I was really worried that the money would run out. We only had money for 6 months. That the money would run out before I'd seen anything really exciting. So when I got back in the evening, sometimes very depressed, there was my mother to say, but Jane, think what you are learning. You see how they make nests at night up in the trees. You see the kind of foods they're eating. You see how they go around alone or in small groups and sometimes all meet up when there's a delicious food available. You're actually learning a lot, she said. And I was learning it from this peak where I sat with my binoculars. It was really sad that she left just before the first breakthrough observation, which I can never forget, and which made Lewis Leakey so excited, and which enabled us to get money for me to continue from the National Geographic Society. And that was that never-to-be-forgotten day when I saw one of the chimpanzees picking pieces of grass and using them as tools to fish termites from their underground nest. And even more exciting, I saw him pick leafy twigs and carefully strip the leaves. That's the beginning of tool making. And that's when I sent this telegram to Lewis Leakey and told him what I'd seen, that he sent a telegram back saying, now we have to redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans. Because back then, we were defined as man the tool maker. So that chimpanzee was another individual that I want to honor tonight. David Greybeard, the first one to lose his fear of me. The first one who sat there when I approached. And if there were other chimpanzees with him, then they were all ready to run. They look from me to David and back and think, well, she can't be so frightening after all. And so gradually, it was as though he introduced me to his friends in the forest. And gradually, I got to know them as individuals and named them with some of those names that are well known to people who've read any of my books or geographic articles. There was David himself and Goliath and William and the old female Flo and the other old female Ollie and Melissa and all of these other fascinating personalities. As I say, my mother had returned to England. The authorities now decided that I was a bit crazy, but I was okay. And so they left me out there. I had my little tent, I had a Tanzanian cook and a boatman, but I spent every day out in the forest. And it became obvious very early on just how like us chimpanzees actually are. We know a lot more today than we did then about the similarities in biology. The DNA of chimps and humans is almost identical. There's just 1% difference. And the immune system and the composition of the blood, almost the same. And the anatomy of the brain is almost identical, except our brain is bigger. It was the similarities in behavior, of course, that fascinated me. Because of the similarity in brain, it shouldn't be surprising to find that chimps are highly intelligent. I was fascinated from the beginning to find that the postures and gestures of their non-verbal communication are identical to ours. Kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting on the back, swaggering, shaking the fist, throwing rocks, brandishing branches, begging. These things are done in the same context we do them, and they clearly mean the same kind of thing. From the start, too, I was fascinated by the behavior of a mother with her infant. And as the months went on, we got this new money from Geographic, and the months turned to years. I was able to follow the development of infants and also the development of relationships between family members. We know today that these relationships are very strong and may persist throughout life, particularly a mother and her growing offspring. And we find in chimp society, as in human society, there are good mothers and bad mothers. And the offspring of the good mother, who's protective and affectionate and above all supportive, they tend to do much better when they grow up than the offspring of females who are less protective, less affectionate, and above all, less supportive. It was human child psychiatrists who showed the most interest in my studies in the early days. The animal behavior people didn't much like my studies because they weren't used to people talking about the chimpanzees the way that I did. And they didn't like me talking about these similarities in behavior. But I went on learning more and more, and I began to realize that the social structure was highly complex. These small groups, sometimes gathering in big groups, separating, traveling about alone, the strong bonds between family members, meaning that often a mother and her offspring, including adults, travel around as a small group. It was only when more people went out into the field and began to study chimpanzees in other areas that we realized that tool using differs from one study place to another. And from watching the development of infants, it was very clear that infants very closely watch behavior like tool using, and then they will try to imitate what they've seen. One definition of human culture is behavior that is passed on from one generation to the next through observation, imitation, and practice. And that's what's happening. So we find all these different cultural behaviors in different parts of Africa that are so very fascinating. It was a big shock when I realized that chimpanzees, like us, have a dark side to their nature. I used to think that they were like us but nicer. We now know that in certain situations, particularly interactions between neighboring social groups, they can be violent and brutal. And there are attacks on neighbors that are so severe the victim will die of wounds received. And that has shocked some scientists who say, Jane, you shouldn't really talk much about that behavior because people are going to say, well, if aggression is innate in human beings, if aggression, as Lewis thought, was present in that common ancestor, and we have had aggressive tendencies all through our evolution, then war is inevitable. Violence is inevitable. But surely we can't believe that. Surely with our better developed intellect, we're capable of controlling these violent instincts, and most of us do, most of the time. And we can also realize that just as the chimps have a dark side, so too they can show characteristics of love, compassion, and actually true altruism. I'm going to tell a couple of stories here. And the first one is about a splendid young male called Sam. And I was following Sam as he walked through the forest by himself. And suddenly he hears sounds of excited chimpanzees. They've obviously found good food. 20 of them or so. And he hurries along the trail and his hair is bristling. And he comes to this big tree filled with feeding chimps and ripe fruit. He climbs up. There's a bunch of red fruit. He goes there. There's a younger male feeding, but that's okay because Sam is about 3 years older and dominant. He threatens the young male away. And the young male backs off screaming. Satan begins to feed. But what he didn't realize is that higher up in the tree is that young male's older brother, who's about 2 years older than Satan. And hearing his young brother in trouble, he swings down and the two brothers attack Satan together. Now Satan screams. To my amazement, a very old female who's about 50 years old, with her teeth worn to the gums and shriveled with age, is feeding. She's been peacefully up in the top of the tree, but now she comes swinging down, drops onto these 3 fighting males, and with her little hands, she starts hitting the 2 brothers. And I think they were so surprised, they threaten her mildly, and Satan gets away, and Sam gets away. And that was Sam's old mother, Sprout. It shows how these family bonds last throughout life, and it illustrates the kind of affectionate behavior and supportive behavior between a mother and her son. And the other story, just very quickly, when a mother dies, if there's an older sister or brother, the infant will be adopted. And if the infant can survive without milk, it has a chance of surviving. That's at about 3 years of age. When little Mel's mother died, he had no older brother or sister, and we thought he would die. But to our amazement, an adolescent male about 12 years old, no relative, he adopted little Mel, carried him from place to place, shared his food when Mel begged. If Mel crept up to the edge of the nest at night, Spindle would reach out and draw Mel close. And he even rescued him if Mel got too close to socially aroused males. So there's no question, Spindle saved Mel's life. It's pretty clear, isn't it, that there isn't a sharp line dividing us from the rest of the animal kingdom. It's a very blurry line. We humans, after all, are not the only beings with personalities, with minds capable of thinking, and above all with emotions, happiness, sadness, fear, despair. And of course they feel pain. And once we realize that there's no sharp line between us and the other animals, then we have to start thinking about ways we use and abuse so many of them in our daily lives all around the world. I don't think I really need to go into what we do to animals, because I think most of us know. And fortunately, there is a growing number of people around the world who understand that animals are not just things. They too have personalities. They too have feelings and can feel pain and fear and anxiety. So I've talked a lot about the similarities between ourselves and the chimpanzees, but quite clearly there are differences too. For one thing, chimpanzees don't gather in auditoriums to listen to lectures. And if I'm asked what the main difference, what do I believe is the main difference between us and them, I'll say it's the explosive development of our intellect. So chimpanzees are much smarter than we used to think. I know a chimpanzee in Japan who can do things using a touchpad on a computer that are truly remarkable. Chimpanzees have been taught the signs of American Sign Language, can learn up to 700 signs, can communicate with their teacher and with each other. They can paint and tell you what they painted using sign language. but it doesn't make sense to compare even the brightest chimp with the sort of brain that sent us to the moon. And so, how did our brain develop so explosively? What do you think triggered it? I personally believe it was language, the sort of language I'm using now. We're using 2 languages tonight, but with this language, I can tell you about things you've never seen. I can teach children about things that happened long ago. We can get together and have a discussion. We can bring people with different experience together to try to solve a problem. And I believe that this is what's led to this extraordinary brain that humans have today. So this leads to this question. How is it possible that the most intellectual creature that's ever walked on the planet, that actually has fired rockets to the moon and to Mars, how is it that we're destroying our only home? We really don't want to go and live on the moon, do we? And if you've looked at the pictures that have come back from Mars, I don't think that's a very hospitable place to live either. But you all know, I think, what we're doing to this planet. Why did I leave Gombe? Gombe, where we're still learning new things, where I have a research team, and where a part of me will always be. Why did I leave? Because I flew over in a small plane in the early 90s, looked down, and I saw that outside the tiny national park, the hills were completely bare. When I arrived in 1960, it was forest all the way along Lake Tanganyika. Now I'm looking down at a tiny little island of forest surrounded by bare hills. More people living there than the land could support. Terrible soil erosion on the steep slopes as the trees are cut down. And people obviously struggling to survive, too poor to buy food from elsewhere, using up the soil in their desperate effort to grow more food, cutting down the last trees to do the same. And so I decided that the chimps had given me so much, it was time for me to try to do something for them. And I also went to a conference at which we were shown secretly filmed footage of chimpanzees, these close relatives of ours who can live for 60 years or more, confined in 5-foot by 5-foot cages with nothing to do for maybe 30, 40 years in medical research experiments, which have turned out not to be helpful at all. I went to that conference as a scientist, planning to continue my wonderful life in Gombe, observing the chimps, writing papers, doing some teaching, writing books. It was bliss. But I left that conference as an activist, and since then haven't been more than 3 weeks consecutively in any one place. After flying over Gombe, it became very obvious to me that we couldn't even try to save the chimpanzees while people were struggling to survive. And so that led to the Jane Goodall Institute program we call Takari, which is improving the lives of the villagers in a very broad way, in accordance with what they feel they want, not arrogant white people marching into an African village and saying, "We're very sorry for you, we're going to do this to make your lives better." No, it was a team of carefully picked local Tanzanians who went in and listened to the people and asked them what they felt would improve their lives. And starting like that, building up trust, gradually introducing other programs that we felt would be helpful. And it's been so successful that the people are now our partners. They've agreed to set land aside, and the trees are coming back all the way around the park. So the tiny park is now at least 3 times bigger than it was, because the people put some of their land into conservation status. And so we're replicating that program. The Jane Goodall Institute is in other parts of Africa, and JGI Spain is working in Senegal with the same type of program. But although we're trying to make a difference, although we're trying to educate the hunters who are going out and shooting animals for bushmeat, although we're trying to start education programs in different parts of Africa, there's still so much that's wrong on the planet, isn't there? If we think about the deforestation, the soil erosion, the spreading of the desert, if we think about the gradual shrinking of freshwater supplies, if we think about the terrible pollution, we spray agricultural chemicals on the land and it gets washed down into the streams and ends up in the sea. And we recklessly burn fossil fuels. And we're contributing all the time to the greenhouse gases, which is leading to a slowly warming climate. And we are doing as best we can to tackle some of these problems. And there fortunately are other NGOs. But the governments aren't going to make the kind of legislation that the planet needs until there's a sufficient number of us, the general public, to support them when one of them stands bravely up and says that we need to stop introducing genetically modified food or something like that. And there are areas in which we are harming the planet which most people don't really want to think about. And I'm going to pick just one, and it ties in with the way that we use and abuse animals around the world. And I'm talking about the increasing consumption of cheap meat. And I'm saying this for various reasons. Of course, there's the cruelty of intensive factory farming. But supposing you don't care about that, why am I talking about it? I'm talking about it because it is leading to unbelievably damaging effects on the environment, cutting down forests to graze cattle or to grow grain to feed livestock, the huge use of water to turn vegetable protein into animal protein, the fact that we're damaging our own health because animals living in these cramped positions, to keep them alive, to keep them sort of healthy, you have to routinely give them antibiotics, and the bacteria build up resistance. People have already died from a scratched finger. It's very frightening. And added to that, when these animals are fed unnatural foods, they're producing more gas. And methane gas is much, much worse than carbon dioxide. So we need to save the forest, to sequester the CO2, but we also need to think carefully about how much meat we eat. Moving away from all of that and thinking about the other things that we're doing to harm the planet, us with our so clever brains. Isn't it awful when you look around the world today and think of the violence, think of the domestic violence, think of the warfare, think of the fighting, and what are we fighting about? We are fighting about natural resources. Isn't it crazy that there are economists telling us that we have to have unlimited economic growth because this is on a planet with finite natural resources? It doesn't make sense, and yet that's the path we're on. And it's Western materialism that's partly responsible. Mahatma Gandhi said, the earth can produce enough for every man's need, but it cannot produce enough for every man's greed. As I was traveling around Africa, learning more and more about the problems facing the Africans, as well as the forests and the animals living in the forests, I began to realize that many of Africa's problems are starting in the developed world because of the big corporations going out and taking their natural resources, among other things. And so I thought, well, I'll have to start traveling and raising awareness, not just in Africa, which is how I began, but also in Europe, in North America, increasingly in Asia, and now in Latin America as well. And everywhere I went, learning more and more about the problems that face us, I was meeting young people, high school students, university students, who seemed not to have much hope for the future. And I began talking to them. And basically, they were either depressed, or they were angry, or mostly, I suppose, just apathetic. It doesn't seem to matter what we do. And I talked to all these young people, and they all said more or less the same thing. We feel this way because we feel you adults have compromised our future, and there's nothing we can do about it. Well, I've got 3 grandchildren. Everywhere I go, I meet young children. And when I look at them and think how we've harmed this planet during the years I've been on it, I feel a deep shame. But is it too late? Can we turn things around? Some people say no. I say yes. Anyway, it was because I felt so terrible for these young people that back in '91 I started a program called Roots and Shoots. And it began with 12 high school students. And they wanted me to go to the government in Tanzania and tell them to introduce legislation that would make things better for the environment. And they were concerned about the hunting of wild animals. They were concerned about so many of the things that they saw going wrong in their world. And I said, oh, I can't, I'm not Tanzanian. But maybe why don't you go back to your schools and talk to your friends? Maybe you can come up with some ideas. So that's how it began. And from these 12 high school students, the program, I could call it a movement, has now spread into 132 countries around the world. And we have members all the way from little preschoolers up through university, with more and more adults forming groups. And the main message of Roots and Shoots, every single one of us makes a difference every single day, and we have a choice as to what kind of difference we're going to make today. Every group of Roots and Shoots chooses for itself, sometimes with advice, but basically, especially the older ones, they choose 3 kinds of project to make the world a better place. One to help people, one to help animals, and one to help the environment we all share. And running throughout is this theme, let's learn to live in peace and harmony, not only with each other, with different religions and cultures and nations, but please between us and the natural world. And these groups of young people, it's extraordinary what they think of to do and what a difference they are making. And I think you heard a little bit earlier from Laia about the Roots and Shoots program in Spain, 40 groups. And here somewhere in the audience is Cesar, who started off with 12 students not doing Roots and Shoots, but when he and they heard about Roots and Shoots, they decided to join us. And now there are thousands of young people in schools across Spain working together virtually to try and do something about the welfare of animals, cruelty to animals, to introduce legislation that would make it a crime to abandon an animal, that would make you guilty of cruelty. So the Roots and Shoots programs is successful because a young person can become involved in something that they care passionately about. And it's all about action. You don't just sit and talk. You actually roll up your sleeves and you go out and you do something. And they are, as I say, making a difference already around the world. So why is it called Roots and Shoots? If you imagine a big tree, some tree that you love. I'm thinking of that tree I climbed in my garden. It's still there. I still count that house as home. Mine is a beech tree. And when my beech tree began to grow, it was a little tiny seed. And little white roots appeared, and a little shoot. And pick it up, how tiny, how seemingly weak. But there is a magic in that seed. It's a life force so powerful that those little roots, to reach the water, can work their way through rocks and eventually push them aside. And that little shoot to reach the sunlight can work through cracks in a brick wall and eventually knock it down. So now imagine the rocks and the walls are all the problems we've inflicted on the planet, environmental and social. And it's all about hope. Hundreds and thousands of young people around the world can break through and make this a better world for all living things. People are always asking me, Dr. Jane, do you really have hope? You've seen so much cruelty, misery, suffering. You've seen animal species become extinct. You know what's going on. Do you really have hope? Do you think I could stand here in front of you all and talk about hope if I didn't have hope? There's a but or an if. It's going to depend on us. It's not automatic that we can change things around, but if we all, enough of us, want to, then I truly believe we can. And my greatest reason for hope is these young people. Everywhere I go, there are young people with shining eyes wanting to tell Dr. Jane what they've been doing to make the world a better place. A little 8-year-old child in Barcelona who came and stood in front of a press conference and told what her group had been doing to help collecting up the cell phones so that they could be reused and extend their life, so that the minerals, especially the coltan, could be extracted, and this would reduce the illegal mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo that is destroying the forests, that is hunting the gorillas and the chimpanzees to death and leading to untold suffering in the poor people who are forced to work for the militia to get these minerals to sell them so that they can buy weapons to carry on their bloody civil wars. So my greatest reason for hope, these young people and what they're doing. It's amazing. On the Jane Goodall Institute website, you can see some of what they're doing. Second reason for hope, this brain. It's been capable of doing horrible things, hasn't it? But think of the good things that we can do. Think of, even now there are alternatives to animal research because people have got together and said, this is not humane. We mustn't go on using animals for this kind of medical research. Just think for one moment. There's a moon. You might see it when you go out tonight. It's probably getting on for half moon. And we all know that we sent people to the moon, right? But when you look at that moon, just look at it and think in a different way and say, oh my goodness, a man walked up there. There was a man up there on that moon up there. How amazing is that? I promise you, if you look at it like that, you will be amazed. One woman came up to me after a lecture. It was full moon and we were outside and she said, I'd lost all hope. But when I looked up at the moon, like you said, I've got hope again and I will promise to do my bit. So the human brain is capable of a great deal of magic. And then third reason for hope, the amazing resilience of nature. The fact that we can utterly destroy a place and with time, perhaps some help, it can once again be restored. It can once again support life. We can perhaps reintroduce animals that became extinct there. And there are so many examples of that. And I get taken to see them when I'm traveling around the world. It's one of the wonderful things. On 3 different continents, I've been with groups of roots and shoots who were making sure that a river that had got really polluted and filthy was cleaned. That meant writing to legislators, it meant talking to the polluters, it meant removing trash. And on all those 3 continents, I was there when, for the first time, fish were reintroduced that had been extinct for 30 years or 40 years. That gives you an awful lot of hope. And of course, as Roots and Shoots spreads, I'm cleaning my river here or I'm restoring this habitat there. And there are people like me doing it all over the world. That gives you hope. Animal species on the brink of extinction can be given a second chance. And then my final reason for hope is the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle seemingly impossible tasks and won't give in. And we can pick icons like Nelson Mandela, who came out of 17 years of hard physical labor in a limestone quarry with this amazing ability to forgive, which led his nation out of the evil regime of apartheid without a bloodbath. But it's not just the Nelson Mandelas, it's the people we meet in everyday life, the people who overcome seemingly impossible physical disabilities and inspire everybody around them. The best example I know of recently, and I don't know how many of you watched, but the Paralympics in London last summer, seeing some of those athletes with no legs, with no arms, with whatever disability they had, it was truly inspirational. And there are people who will not give up some seemingly impossible task, like changing legislation. It may not happen straight away, but they don't give up, and eventually it will. So those are my reasons for hope. And when I'm here in Spain, I have different reasons for hope, because in the years that I've been coming, I've seen the Jane Goodall Institute grow, more members. I've seen the Roots and Shoots program go from 0 schools to 40. I've seen the interest that people are showing in some of these environmental and social problems. And none of this would happen if it wasn't for the wonderful teams, very often volunteers, as here in Spain, but in these different countries around the world. It's very inspiring. And you know what's true? Nobody can succeed on their own. We all need support. I just come into Spain for a few days and go away, and nothing would happen as a result of my visit. Even if I spoke to hundreds of huge audiences, still nothing would happen. But it happens because of these volunteers who give up time and energy and work to make sure that some of these ideas grow and that we make more and more difference in the different countries. So I want the JGI team just to come up, because I'm going to go and they're going to stay. And I want you to see them, and I want to have this feeling of solidarity. I know I'm not alone. I couldn't do anything on my own. And I really want these wonderful people to come up. I'll have to have Federico last, because he's still translating, but he's going to come running down. So we have Laia, who you already met, and we have Laura, and Nerea, and we have Maria Jose, and we have Cesar. So could you all come up so that you will just show your faces, and Fede will be running down. You see, I think we've finished translating, and you can translate from here if necessary. So come, you've met Laia already, you said who you were. So we know, here's Laia.
He hablado tanto que ya no sé qué decir. Muchas gracias sobre todo por estar aquí y a toda la gente que no pudo entrar también. Os pedimos disculpas y agradecemos muchísimo ese gesto. A la gente que ha logrado organizar todo esto, que no ha sido fácil. A toda la gente del Museo, del Ayuntamiento, de la Junta de Castilla. En nombre del Instituto Jane Goodall, como director del mismo, queremos transmitir este mensaje. No hablaré de mis tareas del instituto porque son diversas, pero creo que la más importante para mí y para el resto del equipo es esta que hacemos esta noche, es de transmitir fielmente el mensaje de un ser humano excepcional, extraordinario y a la vez tan simple, tan íntegra, tan honesta como la doctora Jane Goodall, que nos vuelve a dar esperanza en nosotros mismos e intentar dar lo mejor que tenemos, porque realmente vale la pena. Gracias. La doctora Jane Goodall os agradece profundamente vuestra visita y